In the architecture of empire, blood was both the mortar and the threat. Kings and emperors ruled over vast, fragile networks of loyalty that could fracture with the death of a ruler or the rise of a rival. To prevent the dilution of power, dynasties bound themselves together not only with armies and gold, but with the flesh of their own kin. In Egypt's royal courts, the policy was older than the pyramids. The divine pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but the living embodiment of the gods, and therefore the bloodline was sacred. To introduce foreign blood was to invite impurity into the divine vessel. The solution was cruelly simple: marry within the family and marry early. It was not uncommon for girls barely past their first menstruation, or younger, to be wed to uncles, cousins, or even their own fathers. In these unions, consent was irrelevant, replaced by the immovable weight of duty. The girl became queen in title, yet her crown was forged from captivity. In Persia, under the Achaemenid and later the Sassanid empires, royal marriage was a weapon wielded in the open. To unite two noble houses was to silence potential rebellion. If the bride was still a child, her youth was an advantage. She could be shaped, instructed, and molded to her husband's will long before she could form political alliances of her own. Age was not a barrier to the consummation of the union. Indeed, it was often expected. Chroniclers rarely remarked upon it with condemnation. It was tradition, and tradition was shield enough against moral scrutiny. The same logic spread across the Mediterranean. In Hellenistic courts, especially under the Ptolemies, the marriage of siblings or the union of an adolescent girl with a far older monarch was praised as a safeguard of dynastic purity. What modern eyes might interpret as exploitation, ancient chroniclers recorded as political prudence. The young queen's womb was an asset. The sooner it was bound to a single man's legacy, the sooner it could serve the state's needs. This was not confined to the ancient world's borders. In medieval India, alliances between kingdoms were often secured through the exchange of brides. For a Rajput princess, being offered to a Mughal emperor was both a sentence and a survival strategy for her people. She entered the zenana, the secluded women's quarters, where the opulence of jewels and silks concealed the deeper truth. Her life was no longer her own. Here, girls learned quickly that a smile could be a shield and silence a weapon. In these systems, marriage was not a private affair, but a public declaration of dominance. The child bride was proof that one ruler had the power to demand, and another had the will to submit. Her body was both the ink and the parchment upon which treaties were written. The act of marriage itself was a transaction. The life that followed was collateral. Custom cloaked this reality in ceremony. In Byzantium, the selection of an imperial bride could involve the bride show, where girls from noble families were presented like treasures for inspection. The choice would be announced before court and clergy, the political implications rippling instantly through the empire. Once chosen, the bride's age was of no consequence. Her presence in the imperial bedchamber was a matter of state, not personal readiness. The language of power justified what was, at its core, the sanctioned erasure of a childhood. Parents accepted these arrangements not merely under duress, but often with ambition, believing their daughter's sacrifice would secure their family's standing for generations. To refuse was to risk political exile or annihilation. In this way, the oppression was normalized, wrapped in the rhetoric of honor, loyalty, and divine will. The girls themselves were often remembered only through the names of the sons they bore. Their personal histories, their thoughts, fears, and suffering vanished into the broader narrative of empire. Those who resisted were erased or vilified in chronicles. Those who complied were praised as paragons of duty. In neither case was their humanity preserved. When we read these histories now, the patterns are unmistakable. Across continents and centuries, the same justification appears. The stability of the realm demanded sacrifice, and the smallest voice in the court was the easiest to silence. What bound these empires together was not just the strength of armies, but the quiet, unquestioned exploitation of their youngest queens. For the men who ruled, the cost was invisible. For the girls, it was everything. In the world of the pharaohs, the blood of the royal house was not a mere inheritance. It was divinity itself. The king was not simply ruler. He was Horus in life, Osiris in death. His children, by extension, carried the sacred thread of the gods within their veins. To dilute that thread with the blood of a foreigner, or even a noble of lesser rank was, to the ancient mind, an act of sacrilege. Thus emerged a custom as enduring as the Nile's flood, the marriage of kings to their own daughters, sisters, and nieces, many scarcely old enough to be called women. The justification was as theological as it was political. A sister wife was not only familiar, she was divine. The royal pair mirrored the celestial marriage of Osiris and Isis, a union believed to preserve cosmic order itself. This sacred incest was enshrined in temple inscriptions, carved in stone alongside the victories of war and the offerings to the gods. It was not seen as perverse, but as the highest safeguard against the chaos that threatened Egypt's eternal balance. Yet behind the marble facades and ritual pageantry lay human lives, bound to a fate decided at birth. Girls of 8, 9, or 12 were summoned from the nursery to the throne room, stripped of dolls and childish games, and dressed in the regalia of a queen. They were anointed with oils, crowned with the Uraeus serpent, and declared consorts to men who might be decades their senior. In some cases, their own fathers. The transition was instant and absolute, from child to the great royal wife, a title that came with both reverence and irreversible subjugation. One of the most haunting examples was Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, wed to her father in the final years of his rule, and later to her half-brother, the boy King Tutankhamun. Historical records suggest she was scarcely in her teens when first thrust into the role of consort. Her purpose was never her own happiness. It was to anchor a fragile dynasty through turbulent religious upheaval, to produce heirs that would carry both the god, king's legitimacy, and the sacred bloodline forward. The palace rituals left little room for innocence. On the night of consummation, the union was sanctified not merely in private, but often within the sanctum of the gods, under the eyes of priests who recorded the event in ceremonial terms. In this fusion of religion and governance, the body of the young queen became a political instrument, as critical to the state's stability as the grain supply or the army's strength. Her fertility was not her own concern, it was a matter of national survival. Infant mortality was high, and so the pressure on these girls was relentless. Many bore children before their bodies were fully mature, suffering complications that ancient medicine could not resolve. For every queen who lived to see her children grow, others died in childbirth, their names preserved in funerary stela, but erased from the living memory of the court. To the dynasty, such loss was a risk worth taking. Another girl could be elevated in her place, another child wife brought forth from the royal nursery to resume the cycle. Public perception was shaped by religious narrative. The people were taught that the great royal wife was the embodiment of Hathor, goddess of love and motherhood, a role that sanctified her subjugation. Statues depicted her serene and ageless, her youth disguised beneath layers of idealized artistry. But these images were lies of stone, monuments that concealed the cost of her role, the fear, the isolation, the reality of being bound for life to a man whose authority was beyond question. Political crises only deepened the cruelty of the custom. When foreign powers threatened, alliances were sealed not with treaties alone, but with the wombs of young royals. A child could be dispatched across deserts and seas, married off to a foreign king to secure peace, or kept within the Egyptian court to ensure that no external claim to the throne could rise. The choice was never hers to make. In the cold language of the scribes, these unions were victories, proof that the gods favored the pharaoh and his house. But in the private chambers of the palace, they were tragedies played out in silence. For the young queens, there was no escape but death, and even in death, their narratives were curated by the same power that had taken their freedom. The priests would speak of divine harmony. The court would speak of stability. The people would praise the unbroken bloodline. Only history speaks of what was truly broken, the lives consumed by a tradition that turned children into instruments of rule. It is easy, from the distance of millennia, to romanticize the age of the pharaohs, the golden masks, the vast temples, the enduring monuments. But these wonders were built upon foundations far darker than stone. For every tomb filled with treasures, There were untold chambers where the price of dynastic purity was extracted in silence and paid in childhood stolen by the crown. In the end, the pharaoh's legacy was not only written in hieroglyphs, but in the lives he consumed to preserve it. And among those silent sacrifices, the child consorts remain, immortal in name, forgotten in humanity. Their crowns were heavy, but it was not gold that made them so. In the heart of imperial Rome, marriage was not an affair of love or even of family preference. It was an instrument of statecraft. The emperor's alliances were not secured by diplomacy alone, but by the calculated exchange of human lives. And at the center of this system stood the child bride, her age irrelevant against the pressing needs of political power. The legal framework permitted it. Under Roman law, a girl could be betrothed at any age, and the marriage considered valid once she reached the minimum age of 12. In practice, emperors and patricians often moved faster, arranging unions in anticipation of that threshold. Marriage was a transaction, sealed by consent between male guardians, not the bride herself. Consent in this context was a legal formality, stripped of meaning when the person most affected could neither refuse nor understand the arrangement. For the ruling class, such arrangements were not aberrations, but tools. A powerful general might offer his young daughter to an emperor's nephew to ensure loyalty. A senator could solidify his standing by placing his barely pubescent child into the imperial household. The girl's body became collateral in the politics of survival. Consummation was the unspoken certainty, though some ancient jurists advised waiting until a girl's body had ripened. These recommendations carried no force of law. In the privacy of imperial chambers, the emperor or his relatives were beyond reproach. Accounts from contemporaries, preserved in the writings of historians like Suetonius and Tacitus, point to an unflinching reality: youth itself was desirable, its innocence equated with purity, its inexperience with pliability. The scale of these arrangements was vast. Augustus, the architect of the imperial system, used marriage as a weapon as much as his legions. He compelled his stepdaughter Julia to wed 3 times for reasons of state, one of those marriages joining her to a man twice her age. Later emperors followed the pattern. Claudius married his own niece, Agrippina, to consolidate his position, a union only possible because the Senate rewrote the law to permit it. The precedent reinforced the idea that marital customs were pliable when the empire's needs demanded. Behind the marble facades, the reality for these girls was a form of state-sanctioned captivity. Marriage removed them from their family's protection and placed them entirely under the control of their husband's household. A young bride might be relocated across the empire, severing her from the people and places she knew. She entered a world where her primary value lay in producing heirs, preferably male, and preferably quickly. Failure could mean repudiation, disgrace, or political ruin for her natal family. The power imbalance was absolute. Roman patriarchy placed the husband, or his family, in near total authority over the wife. A child bride had no independent property rights, no legal standing apart from her guardian or husband, and no recourse against mistreatment. The marriage contract, once executed, was binding in every way except emotional attachment. These arrangements served not only to unite families, but to stabilize the imperial order. By binding influential men to the throne through marriage, emperors wove a web of loyalties that extended into the Senate, the army, and the provinces. The cost of this stability was borne in private, in the lives of girls who, in the space of a ceremony, were transformed from daughters to political assets. The cultural context both permitted and protected the practice. Roman society valued the honor of the family above the well-being of the individual, and honor was measured in lineage and alliances. The notion that a girl might have the right to refuse such a marriage was not merely alien. It was seen as subversive. Even among the educated elite, the prevailing belief was that a young bride was more adaptable, more easily molded into the expectations of her new household. Over centuries, these unions shaped the very fabric of Rome's political elite. Bloodlines were intertwined not by chance, but by deliberate calculation. The imperial family itself became a web of marriages engineered to prevent rival claims and to keep power in a tight circle. Girls entered this circle as ornaments of peace treaties, as pledges of loyalty, and as vessels for the next generation of rulers. But for all the rhetoric of honor and duty, the human cost remained unacknowledged in official records. The pain, fear, and confusion of these child brides were not subjects for Senate debate or historical inscription. They existed in the shadows of the marble halls, in the unrecorded spaces between political triumphs. The legacy of these imperial bargains outlived the empire itself. The practice of marrying young girls into power for political gain persisted in successor kingdoms, sanctified by tradition and shielded by law. And while Rome is remembered for its legal codes, military conquests, and architectural marvels, the intimate cruelties that secured its political stability remain one of its most enduring and most unsettling inheritances. In the grandeur of Constantinople's imperial court, the bride show stood as one of the empire's most curious and most disturbing traditions. It was a spectacle cloaked in silk and ceremony, yet beneath its polished surface lay the raw mechanics of dynastic survival and control. At its heart was the emperor's prerogative to select a bride from a carefully gathered collection of the empire's most suitable maidens. Suitability measured not by intellect or consent, but by beauty, family standing, and the unspoken assumption of reproductive readiness. The origins of the bride show are traced to the 8th and 9th centuries, when palace officials sought to formalize the emperor's marriage process. Imperial politics demanded a wife who could unify factions, strengthen alliances, and bear legitimate heirs. Yet the ceremony's official narrative, that of a fair and honorable selection, ignored its inherent imbalance. The candidates were often between 12 and 16 years old, plucked from distant provinces, brought to the capital without a say in their fate. Their families, whether aristocratic or modestly noble, viewed the summons as both a privilege and a peril. For the court, the bride show was a controlled theater of power. Girls were transported to Constantinople, housed under watch in the women's quarters, and subjected to inspections that ranged from the superficial to the invasive. Chroniclers describe how attendants recorded complexion, stature, and even the brightness of their eyes, as if cataloging livestock. The emphasis on physical perfection reflected not mere aesthetic preference, but the empire's fixation on dynastic purity. Any hint of deformity or frailty could be deemed a risk to the imperial bloodline. The day of the ceremony transformed the palace into a stage. Courtyards were lined with high officials, members of the Senate, and clergy, all present to witness the sovereign's choice. The candidates were dressed in silks and adorned with gold, a display meant to impress the court and, perhaps more importantly, to affirm the empire's prosperity. Yet for the girls themselves, the finery was a costume masking their powerlessness. The emperor would enter, often flanked by advisors and the eunuchs who managed the imperial household. Each girl, presented in turn, was required to perform a bow, maintain poise, and answer formal questions in a voice stripped of hesitation. Some were praised for their bearing, others dismissed silently with a wave of the hand. The decision, while seemingly made in that moment, had often been influenced by weeks of private counsel and political calculation. Selection was both an elevation and a sentence. The chosen girl would be taken into the palace permanently, her family compensated, and her name formally recorded in imperial documents. She would receive instruction in court etiquette, religious duties, and the rigid ceremonial life of an empress or imperial consort. Yet she would also be stripped of personal freedom, confined to the inner chambers, and surrounded by attendants whose loyalty lay entirely with the emperor. Consummation, though seldom discussed openly in the records, was expected without delay. Age was no deterrent. Byzantine law recognized marital unions for girls as young as 12. While the court poets celebrated these matches as unions of love and destiny, the reality for many was the abrupt imposition of adult obligations upon a body and mind still in adolescence. For those not chosen, the aftermath carried its own weight. Some returned home under a cloud of perceived inadequacy, their value in marriage markets diminished. Others were placed within lesser branches of the imperial household, destined to serve the empress or other royal women. The humiliation of public rejection lingered, a reminder that their worth had been assessed and found wanting under the empire's gaze. Historians debate whether the bride show was truly as common as later accounts suggest, or whether its spectacle was exaggerated by chroniclers seeking to dramatize court life. But its symbolic meaning is unquestionable. It represented the ultimate centralization of matrimonial choice in the hands of the emperor, reducing the selection of a wife to a public ritual of imperial dominance. In the broader Byzantine worldview, this was not cruelty, it was order. Marriage was a tool of statecraft, and the individual desires of a young bride were subordinate to the needs of the empire. The church's blessing sanctified the arrangement, reinforcing the belief that the emperor's choice carried divine approval. Opposition was unthinkable. The bride show faded in later centuries, replaced by more discreet marriage negotiations, but its legacy endured as a reminder of how the machinery of empire could reach into the most intimate sphere of life. For the girls who stood in that long line of silks and jewels, the day marked either the beginning of a gilded captivity or a return home under a shadow, and for the empire, it was a ritual reassurance that the throne would be guarded by a beauty deemed worthy. Even if the cost was the quiet erasure of a childhood, the chronicles remember the gold, the silk, the triumph of imperial choice. They do not remember the trembling hands, the silent prayers, or the years that followed behind locked doors. In Byzantium, a bride was not chosen to live her own life. She was chosen to live the emperor's. In the courts of medieval Europe, the marriage of a princess was never an act of the heart. It was a maneuver on the chessboard of kingdoms, each move calculated to bind allies, secure borders, or end wars. The girl herself was not a participant in these negotiations. She was the commodity exchanged, a living seal on a treaty, her body the guarantee of peace or the weapon of dominance. The law of the church set the age of marriage for girls at 12, though betrothals often took place far earlier. Canonists defended the practice, claiming consummation could be deferred until the bride reached maturity. Yet surviving chronicles reveal that such restraint was far from universal. In many cases, the first night was not postponed, it was the very purpose of the union. When the English crown sought peace with France in the early 15th century, a girl of barely 7 was dispatched from Paris to London. She was dressed in layers of silk and gold, her small hands trained to offer the sign of peace to a man decades older. By law, the marriage could not yet be made physical, but law bent easily under the weight of royal will. Courtiers whispered that the alliance was sealed long before her body had ceased to grow. For the church, these unions were sacred acts, blessed at altars and sanctified by Scripture. To refuse a marriage arranged by one's sovereign could be judged as rebellion. To reject one blessed by the church risked the stain of heresy. Priests preached that a wife's submission mirrored the church's obedience to Christ. In this vision, the young bride's silence was not merely expected. It was a sign of piety. The journey from one kingdom to another was often a march of exile. Girls were torn from their language, their customs, their families, and placed in the care of strangers who spoke for them in court and in chapel. At coronation feasts, the new queen was paraded in jewels and ermine, while her own body trembled under the weight of eyes that judged her value solely by her beauty, youth, and capacity to bear hairs. Consummation rituals were sometimes treated as public proof of a union's legitimacy. In certain courts, attendants would wait outside the chamber, or symbolic tokens would be displayed at dawn to assure witnesses that the marriage had been fulfilled. In these moments, the veil between private violation and public politics dissolved entirely. What was done to the bride's body was not hers to speak of. It was the business of the realm. The justifications for such practices were repeated for centuries. Kings argued that alliances could not wait for a girl to grow older, that rival dynasties would seize the opportunity to wed her first, that producing heirs quickly was a matter of national survival. Bishops and theologians framed the matter as obedience to divine order, where the union of husband and wife reflected the sacred union of Christ and his church, regardless of the wife's age. For some, the marriage was the beginning of a lifelong captivity. If the husband died before she reached adulthood, she might be married again within months. passed from one throne to another like a relic to be venerated, but never possessed by herself. In widowhood, her dowry could be reclaimed, her lands reassigned, her body pledged again for peace. The cycle could repeat until her youth was spent and her political value diminished. And yet, behind the grand facades of cathedrals and the solemn recitation of vows, there are faint records of resistance. A handful of queens, married as children, used their positions to protect younger women from similar fates. But their efforts were rare and often erased by later chroniclers. The machinery of dynastic politics was vast, and the life of one girl was a negligible cost in the maintenance of empire. To the medieval mind, there was no contradiction in crowning a child as queen and expecting her to perform the duties of a wife. The moral language of the time was constructed to defend the practice, not question it, and when the bride's eyes were red from weeping, it was written off as the natural fear of an untested consort, not the terror of a stolen childhood. Centuries later, the names of these girls survive in genealogies and treaties, their marriages remembered for the wars they ended or the heirs they produced. Their ages are recorded as numbers on parchment, without comment, as if they were of no greater consequence than the weight of the gold in their dowries. In truth, those numbers are the silent measure of a deeper cruelty. They tell of a Europe where innocence was not a condition to be protected, but a resource to be spent. In that world, to be a royal daughter was to be born into a life where the crown was not a reward. It was the price. In the annals of Christendom, these unions are catalogued as milestones of diplomacy, milestones of faith, but behind every treaty sealed by a wedding ring was a child whose life was rewritten before it had begun. A queen in name, a prisoner in fact. In the grandeur of Mughal India, the throne was not merely a seat of rule, but a fulcrum upon which the balance of the subcontinent shifted. Every marriage contracted by the emperor was a political maneuver, a calculated step in a game of power that spanned kingdoms, faiths, and generations. For the Rajput princess sent from her desert palace, or the Persian noble girl taken from a court across the mountains, there was no question of choice. Her wedding was not a union of hearts, but of armies and territories. The Mughals, heirs to the Timurid and Mongol legacies, understood that a bride could be as valuable as a fortress. The emperor's zenana, the secluded women's quarters, was not simply a private space, but an institution of governance. Here lived the wives, concubines, and attendants, each bound by rules as strict as any law of the empire. Among them were girls barely into their adolescence, brought from distant lands with the promise that their marriage would bring peace between their people and the empire. The truth was far colder. Their bodies were collateral in a contract signed in ink and blood. The zenana itself was a place of contradictions. It offered the illusion of luxury, silks, jewels, perfumed air, but functioned as a gilded prison. The women could not leave without permission, their movements guarded by eunuchs whose loyalty was to the emperor alone. Every hour of their lives was observed, their speech monitored, their letters read. It was said that the walls of the zenana heard everything but told nothing, a silence that protected the emperor's image while concealing the girl's suffering. A girl who entered at 12 or 13 would be schooled in etiquette, poetry, and the arts, but also in submission. She was trained to walk with measured grace, to speak in ways that would not provoke displeasure, to endure without protest the demands of the man to whom she now belonged. In the official chronicles, she might be praised for her beauty or her lineage, but her inner life was erased. No matter her origin, Rajput princess or Persian noble, her purpose in the Mughal court was the same, to serve the empire's needs. For some, the consummation of the marriage came long before their bodies were ready. Chroniclers rarely recorded such details directly, but the unspoken reality surfaces in the memoirs of courtiers and foreign visitors who remarked on the emperor's preference for youth. In a world where a girl's value was tied to her fertility, the urgency to produce heirs often outweighed her health or will. These unions were defended as the way of kings, sanctified by custom and necessity. To question them was to question the order of the empire itself. The political cost of refusal was unthinkable. A Rajput ruler who sent his daughter to the Mughal court secured not only his lands, but his life. To deny the emperor's request risked war, destruction, and the annihilation of an entire dynasty. In this way, the child bride's personal fate was bound to the survival of thousands. She was both a victim and a symbol, a living treaty sealed behind carved marble screens. The Zenana's rivalries could be as dangerous as any battlefield. Older wives, concubines, and court officials maneuvered for influence, using the young brides as pawns in their own schemes. Isolation, surveillance, and the constant threat of disgrace wore down the spirit. For those who failed to please the emperor, there was no return home. They would vanish into the shadows of the palace, their names preserved only in ledgers and whispers. Yet the cruelty was often hidden beneath the language of honor. Chroniclers wrote of noble unions and blessings upon the realm, as though the exchange of a child for political favor were a sacred act. The suffering of the bride was reframed as duty, her silence mistaken for contentment. In this distortion, the Mughal court preserved its image as a place of refinement, even as it perpetuated practices that crushed the lives of its youngest queens. Some rose to influence, mastering the labyrinthine politics of the harem, wielding their position to secure favor for their families or even shape imperial decisions. But these were rare exceptions. For most, the years passed within the Zenana's confines, their bodies used, their voices muted, their names forgotten by all but the historians who trace the shadows they left. The legacy of the Mughal child empresses is not one of romance, but of coercion woven into the fabric of statecraft. Their stories reveal an empire at the height of its power, unwilling to see the human cost of its glory. Each alliance strengthened the throne, yet it was built upon the stolen youth of those who had no power to refuse. In the marble palaces of the Mughals, history remembers the emperors by their victories, their architecture, their wealth. But in the silence behind the lattice screens lies the true price of that empire, measured not in gold, nor land, nor titles, but in the unspoken years taken from the girls who wore the crown before they were old enough to understand it. In the height of the Tang Dynasty, the imperial court projected itself as the center of refinement, wealth, and enlightened governance. But beneath the ornate poetry, the lacquered halls, and the golden pavilions, there existed an institution that devoured youth with quiet efficiency, the emperor's harem. It was not a hidden place. Its existence was celebrated in court annals and immortalized in art. But the truth of its function was darker than the silks and perfumes suggested. Girls were drawn into it from every corner of the empire. Some were the daughters of noble houses, sent as political offerings to secure favor. Others were tributes from border states or gifts from foreign rulers eager to please the Son of Heaven. A girl's age was rarely questioned. Beauty and potential fertility were the only currencies that mattered. Many were 12 or 13, still navigating the last years of childhood when they were taken from their families. The harem was a living mechanism of control. By accepting the daughters of influential families, the emperor bound those families to his will. Their loyalty became inseparable from the safety, or survival, of the girl they had surrendered. Refusal was dangerous, in some cases. It was impossible. For a noble father to reject the summons was to risk the emperor's suspicion, and suspicion was often fatal in an age where a charge of disloyalty could erase an entire clan. The palace records describe these arrivals with dispassionate formality: names, origins, physical features. They note their ranks, from lowly concubine to consort to empress, each title denoting both privilege and control. Upon arrival, the girls were stripped of their birth names, their identities replaced with new titles drawn from the court's carefully ordered hierarchy. A princess from a distant province might awaken one morning to find herself no longer a daughter of her people, but a numbered consort in service to the emperor's pleasure. The harem was governed by ritual and surveillance. Every movement was recorded, every encounter with the emperor documented by officials. The emperor himself was not bound by these rules. His access was unrestricted, his will absolute. The women, however, lived in a space where every step was dictated by custom. Education in music, poetry, and etiquette filled their days. But this was not enrichment, it was preparation for service. For some, the path to the emperor's favor was swift and consuming. A favored concubine could rise overnight, her family elevated in status and power. But favor was unstable, and the fall could be sudden. Those who lost the emperor's interest often lived out their days in the inner palace, unable to leave, their youth spent behind guarded gates. The walls of the forbidden city were not simply barriers, they were sentences of exile from the world beyond. Death inside the harem was not uncommon. Illness, despair, and palace intrigue claimed many lives. Poisonings, though rarely recorded in official chronicles, were whispered about in private. The emperor's death could bring an even harsher fate according to some customs. Certain consorts were forced to follow him into death, a practice that, though officially banned in earlier dynasties, lingered in the shadows of imperial tradition. Even without such extremes, life after the emperor's passing often meant enforced seclusion until old age. Outside the palace, the public knew little of the women's inner lives. Official histories celebrated them as symbols of imperial grace or political harmony. Their own voices, their fears, their griefs, were largely absent from the record. Poetry composed by some consorts hinted at longing for lost families or the ache of confinement, but such works were often heavily censored before being preserved. In the Tang court's ideological framework, these women were presented as ornaments of the empire, proof of its prosperity and power. But in reality, they were hostages of beauty, each one absorbed into the machinery of politics. They did not walk through the palace gates as brides or lovers, they entered as assets. The transformation was complete when they accepted, or were forced to accept, that their personal desires were irrelevant, their lives existing solely in service to the state embodied in a single man. The Tang dynasty is remembered for its cultural brilliance, its art, and its flourishing trade along the Silk Road. But hidden within that golden age is the quiet suffering of the flowering prisoners. Girls whose lives became footnotes in an emperor's reign, whose families bargained them away in exchange for survival or ambition. Their names, stripped and replaced, have faded into the dust of history, yet the structure that consumed them endured for centuries, replicated in dynasty after dynasty, each repeating the same bargain between power and innocence. The palace walls still stand in places, their stones silent, but they hold the memory of countless footsteps, young, hesitant, and final. They entered as daughters and left as shadows. If they left at all, the empire called them treasures. History must remember them as prisoners. For the Ottoman sultans, marriage was rarely a union of equals. It was an instrument of power, a strategy of control that reached far beyond the empire's borders. The women who entered the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace were not merely companions, they were political hostages, dynastic investments, and symbols of imperial dominance. Some were daughters of defeated rulers, handed over to ensure loyalty. Others were seized during military campaigns, plucked from the Balkans, the Caucasus, or the steppes, often in the aftermath of slaughter. The harem was the hidden heart of Ottoman power, its gates guarded by eunuchs whose loyalty belonged entirely to the sultan. Outsiders imagined it as a place of pleasure, but within its walls existed a rigid hierarchy where a girl's survival depended on obedience, fertility, and the favor of one man. At its height, hundreds of women lived under constant surveillance. They were not permitted to leave. Their letters, if allowed at all, were censored. Their families, if still alive, became distant memories. Upon arrival, new captives underwent an immediate transformation. Their clothing was stripped and replaced with silk garments that marked them as property of the court. They were renamed, erasing the last trace of their former lives. The Ottomans considered this not cruelty, but refinement, a reshaping of the girl into an ornament of the empire. Education followed language lessons in Ottoman Turkish, instruction in Islamic customs, and training in court etiquette. But this was not education for independence. It was conditioning for service. For the most beautiful or politically valuable girls, the path led toward the sultan's private quarters. Consummation could follow swiftly, regardless of age. A favored concubine who bore a son could rise to the title of Haseki Sultan, wielding immense influence over court politics. But elevation carried peril, jealous rivals, scheming court officials, and the ever-present danger of falling from favor meant that power was as fragile as glass. The harem's politics were as ruthless as any battlefield. Concubines who produced sons were locked into a silent competition for the succession. If their child became sultan, they could rise to the position of Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. If not, they faced exile to the old palace. Stripped of influence, their youth spent and their purpose exhausted, some of the most famous figures in Ottoman history emerged from this system. Women like Rem Sultan, once a Ruthenian slave, who secured unprecedented political authority. Yet for every Rem, there were countless nameless captives who never escaped obscurity. Their lives were consumed within the palace walls, their voices absent from the historical record, except as numbers in the registers of slaves and concubines. The cruelty of the system lay not in open brutality, but in its quiet inevitability. Escape was almost impossible. The physical boundaries of the harem were unbreachable, and the social boundaries of the empire offered no refuge for women who had belonged to the sultan. Even those released through marriage were carefully matched to loyal officials, ensuring their silence. The empire knew that knowledge was power, and the women of the harem possessed secrets that could topple dynasties. The selection of brides was not limited to conquest. Allied rulers sometimes offered their daughters to the sultan as tokens of submission. These unions, though wrapped in ceremony, stripped the girl of her homeland, her identity, and her agency. Her body became a treaty, a living contract whose value was measured in the stability it brought to the empire's frontiers. Beyond the politics, there was the personal cost. Many entered the harem as children, removed from their families before they could fully understand what had happened. The psychological toll was severe: isolation, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of punishment for even minor disobedience created an atmosphere of quiet dread. Those who resisted could face beatings, confinement, or expulsion, the latter often meaning forced marriage far from the palace, still under imperial control. The outside world romanticized the harem, imagining it as a place of music, poetry, and endless pleasure. The truth was colder. It was an institution designed to bind women to the throne through dependency and fear, ensuring their loyalty not by choice, but by the elimination of all alternatives. The gold, the silks, the jewels, these were not gifts, but chains disguised as treasures. The legacy of the captive brides endures in Ottoman history not as individual stories, but as part of a system that blended politics with possession. It is easy to speak of the empire's grandeur, its military conquests, and its cultural achievements. Harder is the acknowledgement that beneath those achievements lay the silent suffering of women whose lives were spent in service to a dynasty. Some might call it the price of empire. History calls it what it was: the systematic erasure of freedom in exchange for the illusion of luxury. And within the high walls of Topkapi, behind doors the world was never meant to open, countless young brides learned a truth they could never speak: that in the Ottoman court, beauty was not a blessing, but a sentence. They were the empire's most guarded treasures, not for their safety, but for their use. And when their youth faded, so did their worth. In the Ottoman harem, every captive bride learned the same unspoken law: in service to the sultan, a woman's life was never her own. In the courts of medieval and early modern power, marriage was not simply a union between two people. It was a contract between kingdoms, a covenant between dynasties, and a transaction between ruling houses. Its completion, the consummation, was not considered a private matter. Across cultures, this moment was bound to public proof. The act elevated, or rather degraded, into a spectacle of legitimacy. In Christian Europe, particularly among the nobility, consummation could be accompanied by a grim ritual. Attendants might escort the newlyweds to the marriage bed under watchful eyes, singing ceremonial songs or offering blessings, but the purpose was not celebration. In some cases, noble witnesses remained in the chamber until the bed curtains were drawn, waiting outside to hear the signs that the marriage had been physically fulfilled. The following morning, the bed linens might be displayed, sometimes stained, sometimes merely symbolic, for members of the court to examine. This was not mere curiosity, it was political necessity. The union of a king and queen was the foundation of dynastic succession. A marriage unconsummated could be annulled, alliances dissolved, treaties voided. The stakes were as high as kingdoms, and the body of the bride became the battlefield where those stakes were fought. For a girl barely into her teenage years, or younger, this ritual stripped away any possibility of delay or reprieve. To fail was to bring dishonor, not merely upon herself, but upon her family, her people, and her crown. In the Islamic courts of the Middle East, similar pressures existed, though expressed differently. In some dynasties, the consummation of a marriage was announced with public feasts, the timing deliberately chosen to signal that the union was complete. In certain Ottoman traditions, favored concubines or princess brides were ceremonially escorted to the sultan's chambers, their departure marked by music and formal procession. When they reemerged, the knowledge of what had occurred was carried like a whispered proclamation through the court. No explicit display was made, yet the unspoken understanding served the same function: confirmation of possession, legitimacy, and the potential for heirs. In France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, royal consummations sometimes became outright state events. Chroniclers recorded the bedding ceremonies in careful detail, describing the garments worn, the prayers spoken, and the courtiers in attendance. The language was formal, but beneath the pageantry lay a brutal reality. The young queen was under obligation to surrender her body before witnesses, if not in the flesh, then in the ceremonial symbolism of the act. The bedchamber was treated as an extension of the throne room, and the marital act as an extension of the coronation oath. For some unions, the proof of consummation was required to settle disputes of legitimacy years later. In annulment trials, witnesses were called to testify to the events of the wedding night, attendants recalling the bride's demeanor, the groom's actions, or the display of linens. In cases where the bride was too young for safe relations, consummation might be postponed, but the pressure was never absent. The looming expectation hung over her like an execution date. Among the nobility of certain Mediterranean courts, the ritual was sharpened into humiliation. In parts of medieval Spain and Italy, if a marriage was politically sensitive, elders of the court might insist on physically inspecting the sheets themselves, treating the queen's body as evidence in a case of state. The notion of consent was irrelevant. The marriage belonged to the dynasty, not the individuals. The consequences of failing to produce the expected proof could be catastrophic. Queens accused of refusing consummation risked annulment, exile, or political disgrace. In the case of Margaret of Austria, her marriage to John, Prince of Asturias, was never consummated before his early death, leading to diplomatic tension between Spain and the Habsburgs. In other cases, suspicion of an unconsummated marriage was used as a political weapon, a means to invalidate alliances and replace queens. For the young brides, the wedding night was rarely a private awakening. It was the moment when personal boundaries dissolved under the gaze of politics, when childhood ended not in gradual transition, but in a single, irrevocable act. The trauma was rarely recorded in their own words. The chroniclers who documented such nights wrote from the perspective of the court, not the bride. The language of statecraft replaced the language of humanity, reducing suffering to a legal formality. And yet, within the silence of the records, there are hints of the cost. Medical accounts note injuries among very young brides, complications that followed them for life. Whispered rumors of fainting, illness, or even death after consummation surface in the margins of chronicles. The pressure to produce heirs only compounded the ordeal, making the wedding night the beginning of an unending cycle of obligation. These rituals, though cloaked in tradition, were in truth mechanisms of control, symbolic acts that reinforced the authority of the groom, the dominance of the dynasty, and the subjugation of the bride. They blurred the line between the sacred and the profane, turning the most intimate human act into public evidence. Across centuries and cultures, the practice endured because it served the ambitions of the powerful, even as it violated the powerless. The historical record is clear. The consummation of royal marriages was not about love, nor even about personal union. It was about proof, displayed for all who mattered, regardless of the cost to the human beings involved. The young queens, stripped of privacy and agency, bore the weight of dynasties on their wedding night, a burden imposed not in whispers, but in ritual. What began as a private covenant between two souls became, in the courts of kings, a public verdict on a young girl's worth. For the dynasties, consummation was the proof of a contract fulfilled. For the brides, it was the moment their lives ceased to be their own, and their bodies became the property of history. In the annals of empires, the child queen is almost never heard in her own words. She appears in marriage contracts, in chronicles of coronations, in genealogical tables. She is named alongside the men who traded her, owned her, and laid claim to her body. Yet when the historian searches for her testimony, there is only silence. That absence is not accidental. It is the product of a world in which a girl's wool was a threat, her grief an inconvenience, her truth an irrelevance. The silence begins the moment she leaves her father's house. Across cultures and centuries, royal girls were removed from their natal families and placed in controlled environments, palaces, harems, or convent-like quarters, where speech was monitored, correspondence censored, and movement restricted. In the Mughal Zenana, the Byzantine Gymnasium, or the Ottoman harem, the child queen lived under constant surveillance, surrounded by attendants who were loyal not to her, but to the ruler who owned her. Every letter she wrote could be intercepted. Every word could be reported. When medieval chroniclers in Christendom recorded royal marriages, their focus was on the alliance, not the bride. The union of Isabella of Valois, aged 6, to King Richard Tully of England was celebrated as a diplomatic triumph. The fact that she was a child, incapable of understanding her role, merited no moral consideration. Her own letters, the rare few that survive, speak in the formulaic language of political obedience, revealing nothing of what she felt. Whether this was caution, coercion, or genuine resignation can never be known. The record will not tell us. In ancient Egypt, the names of royal daughters appear alongside those of their fathers or brothers to whom they were wed, reinforcing the purity of dynastic bloodlines. The monuments show them standing beside their husbands, their features idealized into eternal youth, their voices replaced by inscriptions written by priests and scribes. It is possible they protested in private. It is possible they did not dare. The stones say nothing. Silence was also a political necessity. A child queen who could speak openly, to allies, to the court, to foreign emissaries, might influence policy or incite unrest. In many courts, particularly in medieval and early modern Asia, royal women were barred from direct diplomatic correspondence. Messages, if sent, were dictated by court officials. Even queens regnant who had been married in childhood, such as Margaret of Denmark or Joanna of Naples, found themselves forced to adopt the language of their male advisors. Their autonomy was filtered through a system that valued their signature, not their speech. There were also deliberate acts of erasure. The records of certain queens vanish entirely after marriage, especially if they failed to produce heirs or fell from political favor. The Tang Dynasty archives contain numerous entries for imperial consorts who entered the palace at 12 or 13, only for their names to disappear within a few years. Dismissal, exile, or death could end their story without explanation. Without sons to preserve their memory, they dissolved from history as though they had never existed. This silence carries an unspoken violence. It tells us that the voices of these queens were not simply lost by accident, but actively suppressed. Their words might have revealed the personal cost of dynastic politics, the confusion of a girl taken from her homeland, the fear of the wedding night, the isolation of being surrounded by strangers. But to preserve the dignity of the throne and the myth of the harmonious union, such truths could not be allowed to circulate, even when a queen's image survives. In a miniature portrait from a Persian manuscript, in a Roman marble relief, in a medieval tapestry, the art speaks for her. Her gaze is composed, her body adorned, her role defined by her proximity to power. We are left to imagine whether she found moments of joy, or whether every day was a reminder that she was a pawn. That uncertainty is part of the cruelty history, does not merely fail to tell her story, it ensures we can never fully know it. The absence of testimony from these women is not just a gap in the record. It is evidence of a system that rendered them mute by design. Their silence is the final act of possession, as binding as the marriage itself. They were denied not only the right to refuse, but the right to be remembered on their own terms. Centuries later, their silence still holds. It is not broken by the voices of historians, who can only reconstruct their lives from the words of the men who used them. The child queens are reduced to symbols of peace treaties, of dynastic continuity, of imperial ambition. Their humanity remains locked away in the rooms where they were kept, in the letters they were never allowed to send, in the confessions they may have whispered to no one at all. And so the record stands intact in its form, hollow in its truth. The silence of the queens is not just an omission in history. It is the most enduring evidence of their captivity. Their names survive, carved in stone or inked on parchment. Yet the women themselves are gone, buried beneath the words of others. In the archives of power, silence was the final shroud, and for the child queens of history, it has never been lifted. In the courts of kings and emperors, there was a language colder than iron, a rhetoric designed to turn the suffering of the powerless into the machinery of power. When rulers married children, they did not call it exploitation, they called it policy. The union of a girl scarcely past infancy to a man decades older was framed as a necessary act of governance, a calculated measure in the preservation of empire. In medieval Europe, canon law allowed betrothal at 7 and sanctioned consummation soon after puberty. To the clergy, this was not a moral breach but a legal formality, validated by scripture and precedent. The marriage of Isabella of Valois aged 6 to the 49-year-old Richard Tuppy of England was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy between France and England, the end of a bloody phase of the 100 Years' War. The girl was too young to read the treaties signed in her name, yet her body was pledged as their guarantee. Similar reasoning thrived in the Islamic caliphates, the Mughal court, and the dynasties of China. A young bride was not merely a wife, she was an unassailable bond between two powers. In the Tang court, the emperor could demand a girl from a rival kingdom as part of a peace agreement, an exchange referred to in official records as harmonious kinship. The terms suggested mutual benefit, but the reality was one-sided submission. Such marriages were not arranged to enrich the girl's life, they were arranged to disarm her people. To object was to risk accusations of rebellion, heresy, or treachery. Religious leaders often lent legitimacy to the practice, binding it in the language of divine sanction. In Christendom, biblical figures were cited as precedent. In the Islamic world, certain interpretations of hadith were used to defend early marriage. This was the shield behind which rulers operated. The belief that tradition itself was immutable, a commandment beyond human challenge. The justifications were practical, but they were also brutally cynical. Young brides, it was argued, could be shaped to the will of their husbands without the danger of pre-existing loyalties. They were pliable, politically neutral, and fertile, able to bear heirs for decades. This calculation was spoken aloud in council chambers without shame, as though human worth could be measured in decades of potential childbearing. In the Ottoman court, the Sultan's advisors openly sought girls from faraway lands, knowing that youth meant obedience and political safety. A mature woman from a powerful family might threaten the balance of court factions. A child had no such leverage. Her very inability to resist was considered an advantage. The same logic was echoed in Mughal India, where marriage contracts with underage princesses from rival kingdoms were designed not only to create heirs, but to remove potential claimants to the throne from their native courts. Even when critics emerged, scholars, priests, or court officials who argued for older marriage ages, their dissent rarely survived the will of the ruler. The counterarguments were always the same, that a kingdom could not wait for the slow pace of nature, that enemies did not pause for a princess to grow, that stability must be secured immediately. Time itself was the enemy, and a child bride was the swiftest solution. This reasoning crossed continents and centuries, appearing wherever power was concentrated in the hands of the few. The Roman Empire legalized marriage for girls at 12, claiming it was the age of physical maturity, a claim contradicted by the reality of the dangers, both physical and psychological, to such young brides. In medieval Japan, the shogunate justified marriages to adolescent girls as a means of binding the daimyo to the central authority. These unions were praised in official documents, their personal cost erased from the record. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these political justifications was their endurance. They did not arise in moments of desperation, but were woven into the structure of governance itself. The exploitation of children in marriage became as normalized as taxation, a fixture of dynastic policy that could survive the rise and fall of empires. Over time, it ceased to be seen as a choice at all, but rather as an unavoidable necessity, a cornerstone of civilized statecraft. The defenders of the practice rarely spoke of the individual girls. They spoke of territories secured, of treaties honored, of succession disputes avoided. In their language, a child's identity was erased, replaced by titles like queen consort or imperial bride. The person vanished into the role, and the role was sanctified by law, faith, and tradition. In truth, these were not the actions of desperate rulers, but of deliberate strategists. The sacrifice of a child was a transaction, executed with the same detachment as the ceding of land or the signing of a treaty. The damage inflicted upon her, physical, emotional, and lifelong, was dismissed as irrelevant in the face of political advantage. And so, century after century, the same arguments were repeated, their cruelty hidden beneath the formal language of diplomacy. What was called custom was, in reality, a carefully maintained system of control, one that transformed innocence into collateral. It was a system that outlived the monarchs who enforced it, surviving long enough to shape the laws and attitudes of nations well into the modern age. They said it was for peace. They said it was for the future. But history records the truth in quieter terms. It was the systematic theft of childhood, disguised as governance. And for centuries, the most powerful men in the world called it necessary. Throughout ancient and medieval history, the marriage of a king to a child was not considered an aberration. It was a calculated act of statecraft, sustained by laws, customs, and the deliberate blindness of power. Age was measured not in years, but in utility, the capacity to secure an alliance, to bind a kingdom, to produce an heir before a rival bloodline could challenge the throne. Childhood was a luxury that royalty could not afford its daughters. In the palaces of Europe, the church itself sanctioned the unions. Canon law allowed betrothals as early as 7, and while consummation was officially to be delayed until maturity, this boundary was as fragile as parchment. The papal archives record dispensations granted to kings who wished to claim their young brides immediately, arguing necessity of issue or stability of the realm. To the clerics, the matter was procedural. To the girl, it was a sentence without appeal. The Islamic courts of the Middle East and South Asia, though different in theology, mirrored the same pattern. Under the Mughal emperors, Rajput princesses were married into the imperial family at ages when most common girls were still playing with dolls. In Ottoman Istanbul, the harem absorbed children from foreign treaties or the devshirme system, presented as tokens of loyalty. They entered veiled in silk, yet the fabric did nothing to hide the reality. Their bodies were political property, their choices irrelevant. Even in civilizations that prided themselves on philosophy and refinement, the practice persisted. In Tang China, a girl's value in the imperial court was often determined by her virginity and her family's influence. Entire clans would maneuver to have a daughter, however young, chosen as an imperial consort. For the family, it meant honor. For the child, it meant life behind walls, her existence reduced to the emperor's schedule and the reproductive demands of the dynasty. The psychological toll of these unions was largely invisible to history. Chroniclers wrote of weddings and treaties, of jeweled processions and lavish dowries, but almost never of fear, confusion, or grief. What can be pieced together comes from fragments, letters, medical reports, confessions whispered to sympathetic servants. Some child queens bore children before they were physically mature, their bodies permanently damaged. Others died in childbirth, their passing noted in the same tone as the loss of a piece of property. These marriages were justified through the language of necessity. Advisors claimed that waiting until a bride was older would risk political instability, the loss of a strategic alliance, or the intrusion of a rival claim. Kings invoked the continuity of the realm as a higher good, framing their personal desires as patriotic duty. In this way, cruelty was reframed as responsibility, and private violation was hidden beneath the banner of public service. The damage extended beyond the individual. When a ruler's queen was a child, court politics often shifted into the hands of regents, relatives, or concubines, creating new webs of manipulation and intrigue. The young bride was both central to the dynasty's image and entirely peripheral to its governance. She was paraded as a symbol of purity, then sequestered, silenced, and watched, a living emblem of her family's obedience to the throne. In some cases, child queens wielded influence in later years, using their proximity to power to shape succession or policy. Yet even these rare instances cannot erase the origin of their position. Their authority was born from an arrangement that stripped them of agency, a transaction in which they were the currency. The fact that a few learned to navigate the palace's dangers does not redeem the system that placed them there. The legacies of these practices reach into the present. In parts of the world, child marriage remains a legal or tolerated reality, defended by appeals to tradition and religion much as it was centuries ago. The justification has changed little: preservation of family honor, consolidation of property, prevention of scandal, the human cost, the lifelong psychological trauma, the health risks, the erasure of childhood, is minimized or ignored, just as it was in the courts of pharaohs, emperors, and kings. Historical memory is selective. The names of great rulers are carved into stone, but the identities of their child brides are often lost, reduced to genealogical footnotes or daughter-off in surviving records. The absence is not accidental. To record their lives in detail would mean acknowledging the violence at the foundation of dynastic glory. It would mean admitting that the gold of a crown was purchased with the years stolen from a child. As empires rose and fell, the practice endured because it worked. It bound families, pacified rivals, and produced heirs. It survived revolutions, religious reformations, and the shifting borders of nations. It was an instrument of continuity, but also a testament to how deeply power can justify the sacrifice of the powerless. The child queens of history rarely spoke for themselves, and when they did, their words were filtered through scribes loyal to the throne. What survives is a silence heavy enough to speak for them, the silence of a childhood denied, the silence of a life that began in ceremony but ended in servitude. Their legacy is not only the memory of their suffering, but the warning it carries, that when power is unchecked, it will consume even the most sacred stages of life. And history shows that it will do so with ceremony, with law, and with pride, until the cruelty becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. The thrones have changed, the crowns have passed to museums, but the pattern remains. Across centuries, across cultures, the innocence of a child has been the price of stability, the dowry of peace, the coin of empire. It is a truth history rarely speaks aloud, because to do so is to admit that its grandeur was built on the smallest of graves. History's grandeur often hides its ugliest truths. The stories of child queens are not relics of a distant past. Echoes of their suffering still resound today in regions where tradition overrides human rights. These were not isolated tragedies, but systemic injustices sanctioned by power and wrapped in ceremony. To remember them is not to indulge in horror, but to confront it, to see how cruelty flourishes when it wears the mask of culture. Learn their names, share their stories, challenge the patterns that remain. Because silence, then and now, is the throne on which such cruelty still sits.